Good evening. Welcome to the 2025 Tony Judt Memorial Lecture. My name is Stefanos Geroulanos. I'm the director of the Remark Institute, and it falls to me the honor of introducing tonight's speaker, Wendy Brown. Before I do so, I wanted to present our acknowledgements to begin with. I'm most grateful to the YA Style Foundation that has supported this evening's lecture, to Jenny Homans and Daniel and Nicholas Judd for planning it with me, and to Sam Paul, Amy Nguyen, and Lauren Lee, who work with me at the Remark Institute for setting everything up, including the reception, which will be through that door, which doesn't look like a door, right after we get done with the lecture itself. Now, before I continue to introduce our speaker, I wanted to give Daniel, where's Daniel? There you are. Daniel, a chance and a minute to speak on behalf of the family.
Thank you. And thank you, Steph, for making this all happen. Sam and Amy at the Remark Institute as well. And Wendy for so kindly being here. I just want to say a very quick thing, so as not to have introductions and introductions, which is that this August marks the 15th anniversary of Tony's death. It's been politically a tumultuous decade and a half, to say the least. And yet, on reading Tony's work, which I have done from beginning to end over the past 2 years, really for the first time, I'm struck by how many of his preoccupations remain our own. Not all. We don't talk much about agrarian socialism in rural France in the early 20th century anymore, but most. And that's not necessarily a good thing. I think it indicates a certain stuckness in our political and social life. But it does mean that this memorial lecture has become a forum to engage Tony's preoccupations anew and in a style that I think he would appreciate, openly, provocatively, without the usual bromides, but also in good faith and from the left. Last year, it seemed only appropriate to take up the problem of Israel, and in particular, Tony's worry that Zionists and their allies, both there and here, would put the memory of the Holocaust to new authoritarian ends. A year later, as our government continues to support Israel's genocidal war and tries to deport students who protest it, an assault that we here in universities, students, faculty, administrators, I think must combat as forcefully as we can, the topic remains all too relevant. But the theme of this year's lecture, and I hope I'm getting this right, is a different one. Over the last 2 decades of his life, Tony's abiding concern became the future of the left. With the end of Marxism, he wrote in 1997, the left has been, quote, shorn of its agent, its project, and even its story, the master narrative within which all radical endeavors are ultimately couched. In the absence of such a vision, still quoting, to be on the left is simply to be in a state of permanent protest. To be on the left is to be a conservative. And I bring this quote up because I think it's a warning remarkably similar to one famously issued by today's speaker 2 years later in 1999. In pining for an unrecoverable past, wrote Wendy Brown then, the left becomes melancholic. It, quote, renders itself a conservative force in history. And toward the end of his life, Tony, I think, changed and accepted some of the inversion that he had earlier critiqued. Quote, the left has something to conserve, he wrote in Ill Fares the Land, and why not? In one sense, radicalism has always been about conserving valuable pasts. A return to social democracy was perhaps all that could be hoped for. And reading this today, and I'll finish with this, I'm much more persuaded by the earlier Tony, personally, who warned that without a more radical horizon, even social democracy, quote, is just the advanced wing of market liberalism. What would it mean to build a left that goes beyond this? A new positive vision, imminent to, but transcendent of, our present social world? That is a question that Tony posed, but never quite answered. It is urgent still, and I can think of few better than Wendy Brown to help us find our way. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Now, neither Tony Judt nor Wendy Brown really need an introduction, and I will not give a traditional one in the style of reading out faculty websites or Wikipedia entries because you know how to do that. And you probably wouldn't be here if you really needed me to do that. However, I do want to present in slightly extended fashion some of Wendy Brown's trajectories as she, so that we can have them in mind before she delivers her talk. And there's something about a convergence, I noted a different convergence between her and Tony Judt. One that would have struck me as unlikely a while back, and yet once I was thinking about it, I find utterly obvious, and it's something that I will begin with. Why did it seem unlikely? For one, Judt eschewed the category of neoliberalism, notably so in his intellectual testament, Ill Fares the Land, the work that most clearly expressed his commitment to the revitalization of social democracy. If social democracy was already in deep crisis then, today, what is left of it exists in a very strange mode, likely what astrophysicists call spaghettification. Judt was astute about that spaghettification already 15 years ago or so when he finished that book, and the same goes for his post-war of 2004, and even his earlier criticism of the EU, A Grand Delusion, from 1996. Now, in post-war, the word neoliberal appears twice, and in Ill Fares the Land just once, even as Judt sought to make the meaning of social democracy and of liberalism as precise as possible. This seems, by contrast, a term that fudged things for him. By contrast, or by extension, Brown has worked tirelessly to make that term and that category more precise in order to better understand a contemporary predicament, but not least so that we might better understand what about capitalism and what about society has transformed over the past few decades. In her book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, The Rise of Anti-Democratic Politics in the West of 2019, she proposed to theorize, quote, forgive me for quoting you in front of you, quote, how neoliberal rationality prepared the ground for the mobilization and legitimacy of ferocious anti-democratic forces in the second decade of the 21st century, end quote. That project, intended to explain the far-right successes during its, well, now first new heyday, almost a decade ago, feels all the more prescient and pressing now. It isn't so much that neoliberalism on its own describes our current predicament, but rather that the social and political disaster and disgrace that we are seeing play out on an hourly basis on our phone screens follows on decades of this political and economic trajectory that Brown has dissected. She had already begun this questioning in her 2015 book, Undoing the Demos, a study of the thinning out of democracy by way of what she called neoliberalism's stealth revolution. Again, quote, the new form of governmental reason unleashed in the EuroAtlantic world that would inaugurate democracy's conceptual unmooring and substantive disembowelment. Within 30 years, Western democracy would grow gaunt, ghostly, its future increasingly hedged and improbable, end quote. Now, ranging from Marx to Foucault and to Schmidt, from the fantasy of entrepreneurial decision makers to the desiccation of public services, and to the structure of citizenship, and in my favorite section of the book, to the rhetoric of a shared sacrifice as a governmental technique, Brown's analysis is among the sharpest accounts of neoliberal power and easily the work that has had the greatest influence in terms of enabling a serious and systematic engagement with neoliberal political economy. Her role from there has extended, for example, in Zone Books' Near Future series, where the book appeared, and which set the stage for the work of other leading scholars of neoliberalism, including Quinn Slobodian and Melinda Cooper. But let me back up a bit, a couple of decades back. Brown's first book, Manhood and Politics, from 1988, sought to set the terms of a post-masculinist politics by recovering a genealogy of modalities of masculinity from Aristotle through Machiavelli and Weber and on to Arendt. By targeting these constructions and by mapping transformations of the disciplines, she wrote, quote, "We are joining feminism to the difficult task of imagining and sketching alternatives to the existing orders of knowledge and power, a sign that we now feel ourselves to be enough a part of humanity to take responsibility for the future," end quote. She followed this with her study of woundedness. The 1995 book, States of Injury, the first that I read of hers, a book that sought out a radical reclamation of freedom while recognizing how elaborately the very idea of freedom had become co-opted by languages of rights and liberalism, to say nothing of conservatism. She noted especially in that book the peril of unintended consequences in using the very tools of political action, reliance on the state, a ressentiment that suffuses identity politics, the awkwardness of self-defeating appeals to rights, and the two-faced character of treating the state as a protector. All these led to persistence of victimization, she noted, rather than the possibility of a more radical freedom. Across ever more complex power dynamics that seem to overcome traditional hierarchies, all the while reasserting them, where, she asked, could the space for a radical democratic thinking lie? Now, these two books she published while at Williams and UC Santa Cruz before moving to Berkeley, where she taught until 2021, when she in turn moved to the Institute of Advanced Study. A peculiar kind of questioning remained essential that particular kind of questioning remained essential to Brown's thinking at Berkeley. How might we seek a new space for democracy and its key values while recognizing that our situation is fragmented by state power and by financial powers, and that our political language is hopelessly appropriated by these very same powers that hedge us in? I feel like I'm in between two microphones and I don't know what's happening. At Berkeley, she first published Politics Out of History in 2001, and then Regulating Aversion, Tolerance in the Age of Identity and Empire in 2006. For the sake of brevity, I will I'll pass over the second book, just as I pass over her many contributions to widely read collective projects, from Democracy and What State to his critique secular to Women's Studies on the Edge. The questioning that I mentioned before, how to move in uncharted territory today, when our reference frames have been appropriated and the lighthouses of the past seem dimmer and more ambiguous, this is on full display in Politics Out of History. Quote, "When a disintegrating political or cultural narrative seems irreplaceable, panicked and reactionary clutching is inevitable. When this perceived irreplaceability refers to a narrative or a formation already lost or actually lost, melancholy sets in. Even as the future may now appear more uncertain, less predictable, and perhaps even less promising than one figured by the terms of modernism, these same features suggest in the present a porousness and an uncharted potential that can lead to futures outside the lines of modernist presumptions. This book lives in these paradoxes, simultaneously taking the measure of our anxieties about what we have lost and kindling possibility from what those losses may release us to imagine." You can imagine why I so like actually reading that quote. Now, Brown turned this thinking that relished in paradoxes, this need to understand the forces and pressures of contemporary power, and this urgency to kindle possibility in a new direction, in her book, Walled States, Waning Sovereignty from 2010. This is also the book across whose pages neoliberalism stepped in and gradually took center stage. In Walled States, she took on what at the time was a paradox, namely a then newfound proclivity of states to build walls on their borders, most infamously on the southern US border and in Israel, but as she also showed, at many locations on all of the other continents as well. She discussed this in terms of an effort to reassert what was now a declining traditional sovereignty, a post-Westphalian order where walls, quote, "signal the existence of a corrupted divide between internal and external policing, where nation-state sovereignty," end quote, where nation-state sovereignty was getting undercut by, among other things, neoliberal rationality. The more easily the capital flowed across borders, the more emphatically states needed to proclaim, at least for themselves, that they had reasserted their power over human bodies. Key characteristics of sovereignty, she argued, are migrating, quote, "from the nation state to the unrelieved domination of capital and God-sanctioned political violence." We all know very well today where all of this has led. Now I'm coming to the end of this introduction. Toward the end of Undoing the Demos, Brown asked the "where do we go from here" question. She wrote, quote, "The EuroAtlantic left today is often depicted from within and without as beset by a predicament without precedent. We know what is wrong with this world, but cannot articulate a road out or a viable global alternative," end quote. This is characteristic of all of her books. Where do we go from here is a dynamic that she enters time and again at the start and end of these projects, precisely to accentuate the value of her genealogies, but also to show the reality and their importance in the face of the political headwinds of our time. This past year, Brown asked that same question, the where do we go from here, in both of her reinterpretations. One, or I guess twin reinterpretations, one of Marx's Capital in the preface to the new translation of that book, and also second of Max Weber's vocation lectures in her new book, Nihilistic Times. This is my last quote. Quote, "How to plot values within this disorienting present. On the one hand, we cannot orient ourselves exclusively by the compass points offered by established political intellectual traditions. It is not only that the categories, concepts, and methods of these traditions are often inapt to the technologies, forms of capital, and climate emergency of our present, that they imagine the earth and human activity in an outmoded fashion. They're also saturated with the very assumptions and conceits generating many of our predicaments today. We are not the first in history to wrestle with a problem that humans have never been here before. Only the here is singular. Now this question," end quote. Now this question, how to think now, how to forge ahead when we have few signposts in the unmoored space that we traverse, and when most of these signposts have been commandeered by forces that would be clownish if they weren't so devastating. This underwrites today's lecture, titled Listening for Political Freedom. Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you, Stephanos. Thank you, Daniel. Speaking under these auspices is both an honor and something of a comfort. The honor is obvious. The comfort, those of us who read but did not know Tony Judt still miss his intellectual company, especially now in these times. From his extraordinary erudition and his wise political squint, he gave us compass points for charting our world. Historical, always, yet also alert to novel contemporary powers and presences. Prescient, courageous, little that he fathomed about the trajectories of Israel or what he refused to call neoliberalism have not come to fruition, except perhaps the extremes to which the political pathologies and the violences of both have arced, or the degree to which what he thought, namely being Jewish, could protect us from accusations of anti-Semitism. But he plotted it all, those compass points. We live in his shadow. We learn from him still. Thank you, Stephanos. Thank you, Sam, and the Institute, and Tony's beautiful family for having me here today. I need to get organized a little. You may have noticed I have a foot out of order. So I'm going to move this chair. Move this a little bit. Move this a little bit. There we go. I've been working for a while on something I'm very provisionally calling reparative democracy. This is democracy oriented by the enduring damages to both human and non-human life, damages accrued from capitalism, colonialism, and liberalism powered by fossil fuels. As reparative democracy takes shape in relation to these damages, the past they indict, the future they condition, it breaks with liberal, social, and even radical democratic temporalities. That is, modes of relating past to future, ontologies, ways of figuring and relating the human and the non-human, and spatialities, understandings of where democracy resides and matters. I'm going to chart the project in the first half of the talk. Then I'm going to consider one little piece of it, political freedom, and then consider listening as an element of reparative political freedom. So, we begin with the crisis besetting democracy today. Why? To avoid misunderstanding the project in the genre of what we in social and political thought call normative theory, which has a tendency to treat the task of political theory as identifying the good and the right, if not the true, in a largely acontextual, ahistorical modality. By contrast, I take possibility, political possibility, as emerging imminently from existing social forces and from vulnerabilities within those social forces. That is, political possibilities are always historically conditioned by the past and present powers, Marx 101, and also by their remainders or residuals. The second point is important. If for Marx, newly emergent political forms are keyed to historical forces and relations of production, and now we would add finance, today we also know that emergent political forms are keyed to historical damages, exhaustions, and effluence of human production and consumption, both ecological and social. Moreover, these new forms emerge where existing ones are manifestly unable to solve contemporary problems. This situation produces crises. Crises incite critique, practical and theoretical, though not necessarily accurate or adequate, let alone total. And critique limns new possibilities, though not only desirable ones. So I'll speak first of the crises, then critique, then possibility. The crisis of democracy, then. Constitutional liberal democracy is openly challenged today by authoritarian and neo-fascist mobilizations and parties. It's institutionally corrupted by myriad maneuvers to deepen minority and white rule, from gerrymandering to court stacking to executive orders. It's spurned by tech execs and the Pluto technocracy they dream of. It's eroded by the supervenience of markets and the commandeering of state projects by finance capital. It's hollowed out by a constantly morphing form of governmental reason, neoliberalism, that waged both direct and indirect assault on the very worth of popular rule. It's weakened by the degradation and devaluation of education, especially higher education, and by the loss of accountable media, facticity, and reliable narratives. Today, it's further discredited as the century's most brutal genocide and ecocide is conducted by one nation claiming democracy's mantle, backed by the wealth and the might of others claiming the same. Together, these forces degrade the institutions, the culture, and the credibility of the form democracy. This much we know. Both popular and erudite punditry rehearse it daily. But there are other ways to refract the crisis, taking a longer view. The return of the repressed. In this account, all of liberalism's compromises of democracy, from anxiety about popular power to imbrication with capitalism, are now biting back. From the Senate and Electoral College in the US to the House of Lords in England to the European Commission in the EU, liberal democracy has never featured actual popular sovereignty. It's always sought ways to secure control of and against the masses. But these features are now so blatant and brutal that populism, both left and right, is the result. Populism. The basic definition is popular rebellion against elite rule. It's an organic retort to undemocratic regimes masquerading as democratic. Moreover, capital, the radically undemocratizing force, with which liberal democracy has been twinned since birth, has never been more powerful, more wily, more deeply entwined with state projects, and of course more global, hence less submissive to the nation states that housed modern democracy. In this frame, constitutional democracy is not just assaulted by the right, hollowed out by neoliberalism's antipathy to legislative intervention, eroded by institutional corruption, or disdained by technocrats. It's also challenged by socialists as occluding real emancipation, by anti-racists as always already subtending white supremacism, by feminists for whom rights and autonomy jostle against care and connection, by ecological and climate activists for whom the liberal freedoms subtending capitalist production and consumption imperil the planet. Liberal democracy, with self-interest as its animating force and private property rights at its heart, cannot address the climate and biodiversity emergencies, cannot address sustained neocolonial class and race inequalities, or the ongoing ravaging of people and planet by capital. This brings us to another way of framing the crisis. Liberal democracy may well be an exhausted historical form, inapt to the global nature and complexity of the powers generating our most serious predicaments today, unable to reckon with its own violences and exclusions, both human and non-human. An important part of what has brought us to this pass, carrying as it does empire in its belly and capitalism on its back, fueled by burning fossil fuels, whose residuals do not, as Andreas Volkers notes in a jibe at Marx, melt into the air, but hang in it forever, as nanoplastics are now suspended in every body of water on Earth. Direct and angry assaults, longer erosions and corrosions, challenged by the return of the repressed, historically outmoded, together these figure a crisis that calls not for restoration, resurrection, or recuperation, but critique and transformation. Indeed, one way to understand the right's success today is that it is far more willing to abandon this exhausted form than the left is. The right's objects of desire, ethno-nationalism, heteronormative families, unfettered wealth accumulation, unrestrained police power, these may be backward-looking, but its aspirational political form is not. Failure to grasp this blinds the left to where the crisis-responsive revolutionary impulses are in our time. Put differently, the EuroAtlantic world has, since the 90s, been departing the post-war vision of democratic constitutionalism, popular consent, social provision, advancement of human rights. Of course, this vision never extended to the global periphery, to sites of imperial looting or Cold War struggle. But as Tony Judt chronicles in Post-War, it did animate the building of Western social democracies and moderately peaceful cooperation among them. The vision was torpedoed first by the neoliberal revolutions closing out the 20th century as markets and finance were unleashed to savage everything and austerity dictates dismantling the social state were advanced by transnational institutions and nations alike. Tony Judt polemicizes against this in Ill Fares the Land. Still, he did not live to see what would arrive on the back of this anti-democratic force, namely power politics returning with a vengeance. We have, in the 15 years since his death, entered an era, some still imagine it as a moment, hopeful, of fierce extra-legal deployment of political power, slicing through legal restraints, settled procedures, impartial administrative agencies, and liberal democratic norms ranging from balance of powers to the peaceful transfer of power to alliances with other liberal democracies to protection of the Fourth Estate. Though fundamental to ascendant authoritarian and neo-fascist regimes, this embrace of supervenient political power is not limited to the right today. Power politics and its surprisingly close cousin, technocracy, is everywhere exhibiting what it can do to and with rights, regulation, settled administrative practices, not to mention democracy truth, and even accumulation and flows of capital. Supervenient political power is not radically new, of course, and politics has never maintained the distance from law and markets that liberalism imputed to it. However, the ferocious intensity and effects of power politics today, the Millet chainsaw is iconic here, have further compounded the crisis of liberal democracy. So, a crisis that calls for critique and transformation. But what kind of critique? Not of concepts, or what Sheila Ben Habib terms critique of the ahistorical, social, disembodied, moral, and epistemic subject of Kantianism. That was early Ben Habib. And well, we all get used against ourselves eventually. Even Daniel did it with his dad. And while we must address the constitutive historical and epistemological elements of the crisis, for which the Hegelian practice of immanent critique is invaluable if insufficient, we need to surrender the elements of dialectics, progress, and totality in the critical theory tradition that Hegel inaugurates and which extends from Marx through the Frankfurt School. We also need to modify immanent critique to make it less pure and sure, both because of the anti-colonial and anthropogenic norms that must be our polar North Stars now, and because critique has no necessary entailments once history loses its linearity and direction. Today, we are faced with having to harness critique for our political projects without expecting it to deliver those projects as the Marxist tradition did. German sociologist and STS scholar Andreas Volkers, I mentioned him earlier, argues that the temporal orientation of critique is inherently altered by the crisis of what he calls fossil modernity. All elements of modernist critique, he suggests, have lost their prime source of nourishment, the open future once facilitated by fossil fuels. This feature of fossil modernity, I would argue, also severs critique decisively from utopia. Not because all possible futures are necessarily dystopian, but simply because we will never be free of the political and ecological residuals of fossil modernity, residuals that are themselves agentic in the making of planetary futures. Climate change is the most obvious. This is as true of the politics of the post-colony as of rivers fouled with cadmium, selenium, and arsenic from mountaintop mining runoff, or plant and animal microbes now learning how to metabolize plastic. We will end fossil fuel use, or it will end us. But the immense and enduring social, political, economic, and ecological residuals of fossil modernity will shape every aspect of every possible future now. Such is the unique history of the Anthropocene that the Anthropocene set in motion, and why we still need the term, whatever its limitations. Given this conjuncture, given this condition, critique at this juncture, Volkers argues, necessarily becomes reparative in orientation and form. In his words, the critical task is to reckon with lasting ecological destruction, repair what can be fixed, and care for and grieve for the socio-ecological relations irreversibly severed. Practicing critique in fossil modernity means staying with the rubble. A twist on Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, quoted below. Now, Volkers is focused on ecological destruction. I want to argue for a parallel approach to the political form, liberal democracy, that subtended that ecological destruction and built empires from it. Reparative critique differs from the dialectical tradition in both form and content. Form. It has no truck with Geist, progress, antinomies, syntheses, totalities, emancipation, or inversions of these as regress, fragments, or domination, what Adorno and the early Frankfurt School did. Content. Nothing is left behind. the residuals of fossil modernity are themselves agentic in continuously transforming human and non-human worlds, from heating the planet and species collapse to human and non-human migrations in response to climate change. More than treating past damages or exclusions as either practices to be overcome or merely as candidates for reparations, reparative critique is oriented by futures both contoured and constrained by the persistent material legacies of our hubristic modernist powers: violence, extraction, exploitation, propriety, trashing, and neglect. This embeds reparative critique in a different temporal schema from critique bound to modernism. Above all, that beautiful Hegelian Aufhebung, cancellation and preservation as a dynamic of progress, collapses. Instead of negating the false or the bad and preserving the true or the good in a forward motion of overcoming, reparative critique grasps earthly life as now forever occupied by the effects of fossil and colonial modernity. Instead of a dialectic of progress bound to either human ideas, Hegel, or human material production, Marx, or a negative dialectic that retains the humanism but unbinds it from the sunniness of synthesis and progress, reparative critique features the ongoing agency of forces or elements not dissolved, negated, or overcome, but which continue heating, poisoning, deforming, or transforming conditions of ecological, economic, political, even emotional life, and which shape all experiments and practices, including those of democracy. Not only the historicity, but the humanism at the heart of the classic critical theory tradition are finished. The point exceeds the claim that critique must deal with the animate presence of the past in any future we might make. Rather, as Dipesh Chakrabarty taught, critique must now grasp the permanent intertwining of human and natural histories, and thus futures brought about by the Anthropocene. We can no longer be said to interact with nature. We are an accelerating force of nature. Conversely, what we called nature is now speedily changing conditions of human existence. This renders quaint, if not tragic, Horkheimer's classic account of critical theory. Critical theory has as its object human beings as producers of their own historical form of life. If reparative critique invokes different temporalities, ontologies, and spatialities from those of modernist critique, if it bears a different ethos and orientation from critique bound to totality and utopia, if it's humbled by past errors of progressivism and anthropocentrism, these features do not weaken critique's radical impulses. It's boring into orders of power to achieve incandescent exposé of power's effects. But it does bring critique closer to the ground, divesting it of historical meta-narratives, anachronizing its favorite tropes, and replacing the notion of man at its center with imbricated earthly life. Let's see what happens when we bring this orientation to the crisis of democracy today. We begin by marking the difference between the term reparative and that more familiar and freighted one, reparations. Reparation, a noun, is a concrete practice of restitution, redress, atonement, or payment for historical wrongs that condition lives in the present. Reparative, an adjective, reorients and potentially resignifies the noun that it modifies, resets its conventional spatial and temporal coordinates. Reparations are deeds or acts relating to historical wrongs, moral, political, economic. Reparative politics is an orientation and an ethos for crafting futures. It's ongoing and unfinished, as fossil modernity and its legacies of democratic exclusions and violences are unfinished. Its temporalities and practices are thus different from reparations, though it might include reparations. It doesn't collapse helplessly or fatalistically before the immense damages of EuroAtlantic modernity, but also does not imagine that we may simply overleap them. It's in this regard radically untheological. We're neither helpless before a power of God nor godlike in our power. Reparative democracy departs other forms by replacing modernist binaries, human, non-human, past, future, individual and common, culture, nature, political, economic, with imbrication and connection between these terms. In place of the trope, humans and their environment, reparative democrats live on a delicate, damaged planet with other species by which we are either sustained and sustaining or imperiled and imperiling. No life thrives apart from the common. The idea of culture apart from nature, let alone culture mastering nature, is a terrible joke. In contrast with liberal, social, or socialist democracy, reparative democracy tethers the demos, the humans, to the non-human, and to histories of damage bearing on the present and future. Both tethers alter, uncomfortably for many, the meanings and temporalities of justice, which in the Western tradition tend to be at once timeless and immediate, eternal yet presentist, concerned with outcomes for human individuals, or at best groups, alive now. All of this is at odds with responsiveness to agentic elements of the past and the present and future, to the radical interdependency of life forms, and to future thriving for multiple species. In reparative democracy, the immediate needs and demands of the present cannot dictate the terms of justice, and individuals cannot be broken apart from what sustains us. This cannot replaces the liberal centering of justice on rights and distribution, with justice centered on thriving and regeneration amidst interdependence. Rights and distribution don't vanish, but thriving and regeneration govern. Reparative democracy also alters the valences and practices of freedom, personal and political. Freedom sheds its identification with sovereignty and autonomy, sheds too its disavowals of all the powers, ripple effects, and differential histories and positionings bearing on its exercise. To mobilize human capacities for democratic, ecological, and social repair, freedom takes shape as relational, responsible, and responsive. It's organized by residuals of the past and effects of the future. Neither individual nor political freedom lose their foundation in our singular species' capacity to craft or govern powers for chosen ends, but this could not be further from license or entitlement limited by the human harm principle. Reparative democracy also entails a new iteration of robust political equality. It must be alert to deep histories of inequalities, of wealth, class, race, gender, hemisphere, between human and non-human, inequalities that shape discursive norms and agendas in democratic spaces. But there's also this. In reparative democracy, the voiced and the unvoiced cannot count differentially. This cannot necessarily supplement speech with listening as the democratic practice par excellence. And as we shall see, it requires listening differently than what is permitted through a colonial or anthropocentric ear. In this way, the democratic citizen, subject and sovereign, is transformed and expanded, and thus the very nature of political freedom, self-rule, is altered. Still, Pace Jacques Rancière, political equality in a democratic, reparative democratic mode is about more than counting or who counts. It exceeds measure by individual units and does not correspond precisely to representation. Democracy remains a distinctly human practice, but this now means being entwined with our non-human others. How does this work? How do we tacitly if not explicitly, enfranchise life forms that democracy has not previously bothered with, yet sustain all life. Earthworms, coral reefs, rainforests, bee colonies. What kind of equality and freedom affirms that their fate is in human hands, yet our fate rests with them? Framed philosophically, reparative democracy is rooted in that deep ecological materialism called for by Bruno Latour, what he calls materialism at last. Reparative critique does not simply grasp things by their root, as Marx insisted in his critique of Hegel. Rather, it further de-reifies the social processes Marx focused on to incorporate the soil nourishing the root, the historical residuals within that soil as part of what it upturns. As promised, the remainder of this talk is focused on political freedom. Political equality is democracy's prerequisite, but political freedom is its action, its realization. Democracy's golden promise is that we rule ourselves together in order not to be ruled by another or by a part, the rich, the wise, the dynastic, the expert, or by personal forces, markets, money, technologies, church, bureaucracy. That we are politically free only if we rule ourselves is, of course, the meaning of freedom castigated and overwhelmed by other meanings in recent decades. We need to both recover and modify it. How do we enact political freedom? How does a people rule itself? This was, of course, Rousseau's most important question, one he struggled to land through a formulation of popular sovereignty separated from the state, but which kept sovereignty abstract and strangely silent even when the people assembled to express the general will. Anne Norton, by contrast, insists on the noisiness of democracy. A democratic people expresses its freedom by making demands or articulating aspirations for the whole. Jason Frank, seeking to recover constituent power's radical roots, suggests that this initiating power is inevitably, quote, the people out of doors, whether this is civil disobedience or insurgent assemblies. Liberals equate voting with citizen voice. Deliberative Democrats center fair and reasonable discussion. And Habermas, of course, identified communicative action as democracy's essence. Notwithstanding their differences, these diverse threads of democratic thought all identify self-rule with voice, hence the evident importance of speech to political freedom, not just the other way around. Indeed, speech has been taken to be the consummate political act at least since Thucydides, who took corruption of Athenian speech to index Athens' cratering democracy amidst its reach for empire during the war. Famously marked by the Athenian declaration to the Melians, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. At that turning point in the war, force, not deliberation or persuasion, was all that mattered. We saw this, of course, recently in the Trump-Vance-Zelensky debacle. Thucydides taught that democracy dies when speech does. Aristotle supplied the philosophical underpinning to Thucydides' insight, asserting that politics is distinctly human because, quote, man alone of the animals is furnished with the faculty of language, which serves to declare what is just and unjust. There was also the tendentious matter of agents and objects. Aristotle designated all that doesn't speak, animate and inanimate, as mere instruments for what does. What might be the violence and exclusions of politics built on both this privileging of speech and the certainty that humans alone speak? If democratic citizenship is defined by the capacity for expression, whether at the ballot box, in court, the public square, the ramparts, the planning commission, what of those human and non-human who do not speak or do not speak in the accepted parlance? How do they become central to a common good at which the demos aims? How might we improve on the notoriously weak devices of guardianship, stewardship, non-human rights, constitutionalizing nature, conventionally adduced for the unvoiced. There is, in political practice and scholarship, an emergent practice of supplementing or even inverting the emphasis on speech with an emphasis on listening, hearing more, better, differently. This is also reflected in the exploding field of sound studies, which crosses humanities and science, digital technologies and ancient ones, humanscapes and ecoscapes to build our capacities for using this sense. I want to explore listening as a medium of bringing about reparative democracy, its citizens, its spaces, its temporalities, its ethos. But first, let's return one more time to those ancient Greeks, who may help us here, even as they symptomatize the problem I'm also trying to rectify. We're said to inherit both democracy and our free speech tradition from those Greeks. But they knew something about democratic speech that liberalism has erased. The three principles of ancient democracy, isonomia, equality before the law, isopolitia, equal standing for state offices and honors, and isogoria, the equal right to speak and be heard in the assembly. What? Not simply the right to speak, but the right to be heard in the consummately democratic space. Isogoria is the right to speak and be heard entwined, figured as one, and figured politically. To speak outside the assembly was not isogoria because not related to this collective power. Even the Greek notion of parrhesia designates more than simply speaking frankly or freely. As Foucault reminds us, it was always a right linked to citizenship. Parrhesia, he says, does not have the status of a right exercised by birth. It's a freedom one has to grant to be a good sovereign. Isogoria and parrhesia identify practices of political speech and listening as constitutive of democracy, not derivative from it. Liberalism, however, privatized and depoliticized free speech, making it a personal right of individuals to express themselves any way and anywhere. Liberalism does not invoke listening, let alone the assembled citizenry, in guaranteeing free speech. It protects an individual right of expression, but no right to be heard. Indeed, the common defense against censoring offensive or grotesque speech is that it can be ignored. Speech is free, or was, because it's presumed innocent of political power and without power, thus not an action. From this angle, liberal democracy appears founded in a certain refusal of Thucydides' claim about what keeps democracy alive. This may also be why we don't think very well about free speech in politics today. On the one hand, we declare speech the consummate political act. On the other, speech in liberal legalism is personal expression disconnected from democratic sovereignty. So now I want to turn from speech to listening. And the listening I want to foreground is not limited to hearing silenced or backgrounded human voices, though that's essential in reparative democracy, nor are speaking and listening merely two sides of the same coin, as philosopher Susan Bickford has it. Listening is more than the other side of speech because it's a medium of learning, transformation, and connection. It's a different political practice from speaking and has different requirements. It requires not speaking, of course, and being attentive and attuned, as most animals cock an ear to listen for prey, predators, water, or danger. New practices of what sound studies scholars call deep listening, composer and activist Pauline Oliveros coined the term actually in the 70s, bears potential to bring into being democracies alert to conditions of survival and thriving for both human and non-human life historically excluded from politics. Deep listening, which involves what Oliveros called simultaneously focused yet global attention, as reparative democracy must engage both, Deep listening aims at including more sound, more world than much ordinary listening today. Focal attention is concentrated on a specific local sound, while global attention takes in all the sounds around us, including those we might remember or imagine. Deep listening also entails both interpretation and translation, two vital practices of reparative democracies and heretofore excluded by most democratic theory. From Mill to Rawls to Habermas, the democratic imaginary has been one of linguistic transparency and monolingualism. This will no longer do. Let me return one last time to Aristotle, his claim that politics is distinctively human because language is. Other animals emit sounds, Aristotle says, but only human language permits us to deliberate and judge together about what is right or just. If other animals don't do this, they don't have politics in the Aristotelian sense. Yet, plant and animal and earth science teaches us now that most non-human life does speak, and that all life, from trees to whales, bats to coral reefs, listens to detect food, water, danger, or degraded conditions. Moreover, many species, including bees, worms, and plants, listen to one another to coordinate themselves for food, for shelter, for symbiosis, or defense. Nor does listening always require external ears. When flowering plants are exposed to the sounds of buzzing pollinator bees, they respond by producing sweeter nectar in minutes. Through electrical impulses, trees warn each other about parasites, about grazing predators, about fires. Tortoises gather through vocalizations they register as vibrations in their bodies. Almost all animals listen to collectively thrive amidst contingency and change. We could call this politics. Humans need to learn to listen for just such purposes. Developing practices of deep listening can help transform us into reparative democrats, transform the politics that currently sustains and sanctions irreversible damage to planetary life, both ours and the non-humans. This doesn't require that we actively communicate with animals, earthworms, or soil, only that we become alert to their liveliness, to what they need to thrive, and to our codependence with them. This is the domain opened on the one hand by sound studies, and of course on the other by critical histories of indigeneity, where such alertness was often quotidian and not coincidentally, where such peoples tended toward more sustainable relations with non-human life than fossil modernity features. The point is not merely to displace anthropocentrism, but to overcome a politics of anthropectomy, in which we imagine and treat the non-human as our absolute other. But we are so inept at listening. We have filled the world with so much noise. We have so degraded listening relative to speaking that revalorizing and retraining our listening capacities is nothing short of a revolutionary proposition. Compared to other life forms, humans have innately poor hearing. We don't hear infrasound, which permits elephants to communicate with each other across 30 or 40 miles. We don't hear ultrasound, which is what permits bats and sharks and dolphins to echolocate. And this impoverishment is inversely proportional to our noisiness. As terraforming and infrastructural creatures, we generate loud orders that further dim our already limiting listening capacities. Then, as we add noise-canceling devices to our cyborgian existence, we wall out our own human noise along with everything else. Now we talk over those devices as well. The human cacophony grows, other sounds recede, including sounds of agony at the sight of organized human violence. We're also not easily inclined to hear earthly life in general or apart from our own. Self, family, class, tribe, race, nation often carve the limit of our listening, as the mass failure to hear incalculable suffering amidst contemporary genocides and ecocides makes clear. Listening to earthly life and our relation to it, known as bioacoustics and ecoacoustics, often requires assistive technologies, amplification, algorithms, AI, that record and replicate cycles of life and death, from glaciers melting and species vanishing to coral reefs regrowing. As Karen Baker writes, these technologies can serve as a kind of Google Translate between humans and non-humans. The necessary infrastructure for deep listening also includes educational frameworks and political discourses orienting us to post-humanist social relations and practices of alertness. Dennis Shep formulates the transformative value of deep listening as he studies residuals such as iron sludge, residuals which he argues often speak as barely audible voices arising from the debris of human history. He writes, "Perhaps the key to overcoming the deadlocks of our time is to cultivate an openness to other non-human points of view and allow the object to step out of the inert materiality to which modernity relegates it. The object that is granted the right to speak irritates the conceptual distinctions that sustain our anthropocentrism. By listening attentively," he adds, "we may alter the coordinates that determine who can and cannot speak, what can and cannot be heard. Questioning familiar narratives of progress, we may learn that not all that speaks is human, and that the material world around us is not merely the passive background against which our history unfolds." If democratic practices of deep listening, especially to the unvoiced, sounds too big and too hard, consider again that most Indigenous communities have been expert at it, and also that continuing on our current disastrous path is not an option. We know that almost everything about existing ways of human life must change for the planet and Homo sapiens to thrive in the future. Why not democracy? More than merely a practical virtue, listening to the unvoiced helps move political freedom into a reparative democratic modality. Quieting down to listen brings us out of ourselves, generates the humility and openness essential to a reparative ethos. Instead of the loudest and most amplified voices prevailing, which is what happens in all capitalist democracies, the requirement of listening, especially to what is challenging or foreign, evens things out. It also promises to break up hegemonic discourses with other accounts of being, other accounts of experience. It brings about more voices and more variety among them to invite the reckoning with difference, essential to reparative democracy. Placing listening at the heart of political freedom, instead of reifying nature and the foreigner, and fostering conceits of mastery, potentially invites a practice of co-living as it takes the measure of many agencies. Instead of locating political freedom in reason and the state, a la Hegel, or dissolving it into collective ownership and control, Marx, both of which entail those false conceits of mastery, we find political freedom through creative political invention and engagement with what sustains us. Instead of oscillating perilously between freedom from and freedom to, we find freedom with. To mobilize human capacities for democratic, ecological, and human repair, listening facilitates practices of freedom that are relational, responsive, and responsible. To conclude, one aim of this work is to discover conditions and practices for orienting humans toward the earthly lives with which we are materially imbricated, but without devaluing our distinctiveness as the creatures who generate gigantic orders of power that require human politics to modify, transform, or steer. A second aim of the project is to simultaneously de-individuate and expand political belonging. Learning to listen to the sounds of life allows us to grasp differently our own belonging and the matter of who belongs. Third, listening to the unvoiced, that is, to sounds that may not always be words or sentences, but has meaning nonetheless, makes translation into a necessary and quotidian practice of democratic life, understanding, and representation. It makes resistance to monolingualism and its cousin, ethno-nationalism, into essential democratic practices. Of course, listening is not the only sense we need to sharpen and deepen for reparative democracy. We need to see better and farther. We need to smell more curiously and interpretively. Thank you, Nietzsche. We need to touch more delicately and knowingly, less roughly and ignorantly. Each of these could abet our connectedness to other lives and life forms. Each has the potential to agitate, activate, or soothe. Each invites curiosity. Each instructs. I've dwelt on listening because it's critical to reorienting Democrats toward the fragility and the interdependence of life, and toward the residuals of the past in any futures that we might make, and because it augments the liberal preoccupation with speech. These things place it at the heart of democracy in a post-humanist, reparative frame. Thank you. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you.
I guess I will just moderate the discussion from here on. We're going to need to get to a microphone. So please hold on for a second, but yeah. Oh, and please do keep your questions to under a minute, and we end them in a question mark.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I just had a very short question. You ended by using the word soothe, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about the idea of soothing and what it means to soothe in your theory of listening and what that might mean.
So it's in some ways a response to a tradition of thinking about democracy as always agonistic. And I'm not against agonism. I think it has a place. I mean, obviously must have a place. But I think that it doesn't exhaust the things that might draw people to being democratic. I don't think everyone has a taste for agonism. I don't think agonism has been well theorized vis-a-vis the excluded. I don't think it has been well thought through vis-a-vis feminism, even though feminist theorists have been among those who've advocated it. And I think if we are going to give democracy a shot again in a different form, it must also have some qualities that soothe. And I think that doesn't mean communitarianism. It means that when I said, you know, learning to use our senses and particularly listening can be jarring, it can be disturbing, it opens us to worlds that are, among other things, damaged and pained, and also innate and natural violences in worlds of human and non-human. But at the same time, many of us also are soothed by everything from the sounds of birds chirping in the morning to images in the world of again, human and non-human life. And I think we have to bring that into our thinking about democracy if it has any chance of being alluring ever again. Did you want to say something about it? Is it okay if we're a little bit dialogical? Okay.
No, I just found it really powerful because I think this question of desire and attraction to democracy, that it has to be something that delights us. Maybe I'm thinking of Jane Bennett's language of enchantment. Like we need to feel comforted by each other, and that even when you're talking about translation and monolingualism, I'm even thinking about, listening to people who may not even speak a different language, but just talk about their lives in ways that we don't understand and what it would mean to actually listen. And then I don't think we talk a lot on the left about the need to reassure, and that reassuring people might also be a form of organizing.
No, indeed.
Right? So
I think reassuring, envisioning pictures of worlds that are more attractive than this one. We've been woeful on all of these topics, and it's not working.
Yeah, I'm gonna stand up. Thank you so much for the talk. I thought it was really generative. I didn't quite understand why you emphasize so much the demarcation from the Marx Frankfurt School tradition. It seems to me that you would find a lot of motives exactly in that tradition that go in exactly in the direction that you want for your program. You have this whole debate about Marx's materialism, John Bellamy Foster and Kuhai Saito emphasizing that Marx is not a thinker of mastery over nature, but he was really influenced by this idea of sensualism. And especially in the Frankfurt School, you have Benjamin's notion of remembrance. He asks us to not look towards the future, but to look back. And you have Adorno's theory of the non-identical and so on. Yeah. So, and on the other hand, the idea of reparation seems to be much more committed to a teleological notion of progress to me, or restoration at least. So why is it so important for you to make this distinction so strongly rather than looking for possible
Great
tools
question.
in different
Thank
traditions?
you. Yeah, in part to provoke people like you, and myself to think about the limitations of that tradition. So let me just recap it really briefly. What the real distinction is. I think the most important thing, and Benjamin is the one guy who I think troubles what I'm calling the rupture. But the most important thing for me is this notion of residuals persisting from the past into the present and the future, and conditioning and shaping the future and becoming agents in the future. And again, nothing is more dramatic in this regard than climate change. We're not going to overcome it. We're not going to leave it behind. Fossil modernity has created the future of the planet. And the future of the planet will always have not just the legacy or the remembrance of fossil modernity, but the active agencies of the residuals of fossil modernity in the form of all the petroleum products all over the planet, all the species collapse that it has introduced through climate change and through poisoning of rivers and land masses and so forth. And that, I believe, I'm going to just be really summarical here. I do not think the Hegel-Marx Frankfurt School tradition can comprehend. I really think that what you have in the tradition of Aufhebung is an overcoming and preserving that is either preserving what is good, or you get the Adorno negative dialectics with and the notion of regression, the kind of thing that Rahel Yegi and others are working out to explain where we are now. But history is moving along a train track. And I'm not saying it's totality. It's, I know all those critiques of a bad reading of Marx. And I love Marx. I cannot think without him, but I cannot think with him about the problematic of either the way the earth has been shaped by ecologically by fossil modernity, but also politically, economically. I think I think one of the limits of Marxism in thinking about global North-South relations is precisely that. We are not ever going to, as it were, redeem or fully transform the ways that the global order of things, now I'm leaving the planetary aside, the global order of things has been shaped by 2.5 centuries of empire and colonialism. It doesn't mean we can't do better. That's what the reparative is about. But there's no overcoming. There's no radical overcoming. There's no radical transformation. There's no radical emancipation from that. So you and I would probably need 3 hours to argue through whether you still think you can get to these points within that tradition that I'm saying I have to veer from. I'm dragging that tradition there. That, you know, obviously, when you start a talk and you say you're going to do crisis, critique, transformation, you're in that tradition. But I'm changing what crisis means, what critique means, and what transformation means. So I'm in it, but I'm not as in it as you are. Do you want to say something back? Because I bet you do. You get 30 seconds.
It's unfair. No, I mean, it seems to be a not so important debate. No, do you do what we do with Adorno or with somebody else? So I don't really want to defend Adorno. I think there is lots in there. This idea of doing nothing like an animal, where you have this idea of listening to our own animalistic nature, of passivity, of not being active, and so on. So I find a lot of tools in this tradition to do exactly what you want to do, but maybe it's not so important where we get our tools from. So
I mean, I find a lot of tools too. I'm happier with letting it go when it doesn't work. And so the ecological theory and ecological thinkers, I should say, I've been hanging out with for the last 3 years have helped me more than that tradition has to try to think through both our predicament and what the possibilities are. And it's not that I'm getting rid of it. And in certain crowds, I wouldn't touch this critique. But here I thought you could handle it.
fair enough. Thank you.
Can I ask you then, there's something peculiar about the temporality of listening as you're presenting it. On the one hand, there's a great urgency to it in the way that you describe it. And at the same time, if we simply started listening right now, which is not what you mean, it would be as though we would let what someone referred to as this oligarchy take over in a constant, like, ever louder scenario. I understand that to imply that there's a longer term version of what you mean by listening, that the activity involved in it, or the political act involved in it, involves the building of a community, or involves of a non-human community, if you will, or a quasi-human community. I'd like to ask you how you think about time in these terms, about this urgency and longer term dimension of this, if that's not an unfair way to describe it.
No, it's a beautiful question. I don't think I have an immediately smart or profound response, but I think I would say this to begin. You're absolutely right. I'm not saying, oh, everybody leave this room and, you know, cock your ears to whatever you can hear in New York City. We know how that goes for both the sounds and the listeners. I'm suggesting that it's also that there's education in listening, you know, the distinction between listening and hearing that sound studies makes is, you know, hearing is the physical activity, listening is the intellectual practice of becoming good at it, deep listening. And so there's, as it were, training or education in it, but I'm also suggesting that the temporality of listening has the potential to bring this past, present, future relationship in that I'm trying to recover from, like, the immediate temporality of liberal democracy, you know, justice being an immediate, even radical opposition within it. You know, when you think about justice demands in the square, you know, what do we want justice? When do we want it? Now. And that immediacy is everywhere in our political vocabulary, even as the left is very good at, it's one of its better features, at being able to draw historical forces from the past into the present that are shaping the present. But it's the present future thing that I'm trying to draw listening for. And in part, it's about hearing what is needed to thrive in a regenerative way, in a reproductive way. And I'm not referring to human reproduction. But if justice has to be reproductive, if freedom itself is something that transpires in time, not just space, and has a relationship of past to future, that really changes the coordinates of basic democratic principles: freedom, equality, justice. If they all have that past, present, future, with residuals from the past shaping the present and constraining the future, how does listening become enabling there? And I want to suggest that listening to the unvoiced, human and non-human, listening differently. I'm also saying shutting up. And you're right. You know, I'm not saying we should all shut up right now and let the right win. That's not the practice I'm bearing in mind. But I am saying that these practices that I'm tapping or trying to articulate are already emergent. I mean, they're emergent in part because, I mean, they're emergent in places like Black Lives Matter. Who did we not hear? They're emergent in places like the Atlanta forest struggle over those anarchists all hanging out in the forest, listening constantly to the sounds of the forest, and then being able to reproduce those sounds in city council rooms when they were arguing against replacing the forest in Atlanta with a gigantic police training facility. So it's already here. I'm that kind of thinker. Like, what's the emergent thing that's happening, and then how do we theorize it? Wasn't a good answer to your question, but it's a beginning. Okay.
There was someone in the back that said-
Yeah.
Well, there's a bit of prehistory to this question, so I'll say quickly that 30 years ago, I was a student at NYU, and Derrida was doing his seminars on hospitality, and so it's not just about now in Palestine, but I remember asking him in relation to thinking deconstruction and hospitality, you know, this kind of insistence when I was much younger that and I still have that insistence that there are moments where one has to choose a side when you're confronted with a force that wants to obliterate. And I'm just curious in terms of your own thinking through this reparative democracy, where does it situate itself, not only in relation to Palestine and what's happening, but precisely looking at a period of time we've just lived through, kind of visibilization of the horrors of liberal democratic kind of injustice, let's say, or colonial violence, or this capacity to pretend that the internal is cherishable and so beautiful, and then externally, whatever may happen, in fact, we may fund it. And then, of course, the confusion of this moment where, as the universities have been closing down all those liberal values, destroying them, getting rid of faculty, students, you have a more, horrific version of that sort of democratic process happening with this new regime here. So I was just thinking, what is a reparative democrat? How does it sort of navigate this condition that we're in right now, or conjuncture?
No, it's a
There
good
was a
question.
question mark.
Yeah, no, there was definitely a question mark. I have two answers. One is that we are in emergency times. We're in times of having to not only resist, but also try to profoundly discredit the forces that we are resisting, and also protect those who are most vulnerable to deep violence by those forces. And I'm not sure what that has to do with reparative democracy. That's a battle. That's a big battle. And I am thinking, and have been thinking for several years, about whether there could be a successor form, to call it what you will, bourgeois democracy, capitalist democracy, but also social democracy, all the discredited forms. And And this project is different from what we have to do today, tomorrow, this week, next week, as we fight for the very life of our universities, as we fight for the very lives of some of our comrades, as we fight for what I also called the discrediting of a force that is not liberal democratic, but I'm suggesting I don't think liberal democracy is going to be the best retort to that. I think there's another kind of retort. It's not necessarily immediately reparative democratic. So I'm trying to give you an answer that says, yeah, we can use some elements of this now, but really the question is how to be strategic, how to discredit, how to resist, how to protect. And those are not necessarily even democratic politics. I'm suggested early in my talk that their side is deeply engaged with an anti-democratic power politics, and I think we have to do the same. And I'm not saying that that can't have democratic elements. One of the things that I find interesting about my favorite radical democratic theorists is that they are thinkers who insist that the people's force is the real site of democracy, not the rule of law, not constitutionalism, but the people's force. And by that, they don't necessarily mean violent force. They mean the people gathered forcefully. And I agree with that. So, but those are emergency moments. Those moments of the people's force asserting itself to hold back the dark or to preserve something or to stop something, whether it's a devastation of a university or a devastation of a people or a devastation of a forest, that can be organized democratically to a degree, but the important element is the force. So it's a different project to some degree than what I've given you here, even though there may be some elements of connection.
Thank you so much. You mentioned a number of times the kind of indigenous traditions that have thought through these things, and one that came to mind constantly as you were describing what reparative democracy looks like is the Quechua concept of sumac cauce, right? And translated into Spanish as buen vivir, translated badly into English as living well. And so I wonder, given that we have 30, 35 years of this theorizing about of the ways that the human and the non-human, this sort of relational understanding, what kinds of inheritances does this idea of reparative democracy owe to that kind of tradition, to something like sumac cauce that is coming from completely outside of the kind of intellectual tradition that you outline here?
So it's a challenging question because not only, the answer is a lot, but at the same time, the answer is white people, don't be stupid. Don't just go, oh, they had it right all along and now we bowed down and we don't know anything and we're still utterly ignorant about all the depths and all the details and we homogenize this whole thing called the indigenous. So we don't want to be stupid like that. But at the same time, I think it's no accident that in so many of the struggles against ecological devastation, it's not just that they happen to be twinned with where indigenous people live, especially in Latin America, but that the indigeneity offers a language, a politics, a form of listening, and a form of protection. So on the one hand, yes, it owes a ton to it, as you say, now 30 years, maybe even 40 years of excavating, digging this up, translating, educating white people. But at the same time, I want to suggest, and that's the reason I kept going back to Aristotle and Hegel and Marx and playing with the Frankfurt School tradition, we can't just go over. That's when we're stupid. We can learn, we can be indebted, but we also, I'm saying we in a EuroAtlantic world have you can call it a settler colonial, or you can call it a Western civilizational tradition of thought that shapes how we think about democracy. And I'm trying to pull on that to both reveal its limitations, but also pull it into something else. So that's my answer.
Final question, Sean, if there's one. Okay, by now you're okay with the stop anybody but you also.
Thank you so much. A quick question that is actually huge and that doesn't want to be redundant with the precedent one. And I'll just briefly explain why. How do you think we can imagine and practice reparative democracy in a context of war?
Mhm.
And I'm asking because from everything that I know from experience on the ground in Ukraine, people have learned to listen differently for their own survival. The difference between a plane with a bomb or without a bomb, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And obviously, war in a context of liberal democracy is the end of democracy, even though it doesn't look like this, but the executive takes power. So obviously, coming from Europe, this question really wants to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I just have to deposit that one in my brain.
Yeah, I'm not interested in defending the Frankfurt School, but I think there is a lot in Adorno which is very close to what you want to do, and that would provide very good resources for you. I mean, first of all, this.
Let me actually ask you not to continue this. The question has been addressed a little bit. Give me a chance to have one more person who is in front of you, and this can be continued. And this can be continued afterward.
But I'll still say something about it.
Animals and listening.
I'll be brief, although I have two quick questions. One is the relationship between residuals in the kind of material sense of petrochemicals in relationship to residuals as ideologies or epistemic formations. And I ask that in part just because of the relationship of what you're doing to critique and genealogy. Mm-hmm. And the related question is then, is only modernity a residual? You constantly talk about the residuals of fossil modernity. What about, are there pre-modern residuals, particularly in this expanded sense? The Greeks come back. In what way are they functioning in the economy of residuals?
Okay. Reparative democracy and war. I don't know very much about it. I need to. I mean, in some ways, the earlier answer to the question about our current predicament here is describing us as being at in a condition of warlikeness, different from bombs falling, but still. And I take what you're saying to be that you're seeing something more than what often get called communities of solidarity. You're actually seeing democratic practices, including listening practices, including practices of being together and thinking together and governing selves together that have that characteristic of something. It's certainly not liberal democracy, and on the other hand, it's. Yeah. So I that's all I can say is that I don't know very much and I need to think about it. Let me say two things about Adorno. So I'm not trying to get rid of these guys. I'm trying to move them to the side of the stage so that I can think with them and without them when I need to. Adorno's thoughts, I mean, both dialectic of enlightenment, but also the work of that last piece on nature is kind of mind-blowing and fucked up. I mean, that I can't remember what it's called, that very last piece that he wrote, like it was like the last thing he wrote before he died. And he's struggling to get to the place where nature actually is part of the scene rather than other to us. But the humanism is so strong in it that he can only do it by nature becoming a kind of human figure. And I think with him a lot, but I don't want to be governed by that tradition for the reasons that I've talked about. And now I'm going to go to the last question to finish the point. The residuals that I think the tradition of critique and progress of Hegel, Marx, and the Frankfurt School could not comprehend include what kinds of humans we've become, what kinds of geopolitical configurations there are in the world. That's why I said the North-South thing is so important. You know, understanding, of course, there has to be climate justice. Of course, there has to be other kinds of justice to rectify several centuries of colonialism. But it's not like we're going to unmangle the colonial past by through reparations, or even through, imagine it, a communist revolution round the world. We still have that colonial past all over the ground, in humans, in communities, in political structures. I mean, that's one of the things we've learned from decolonization. And so it's in all of those things, but you're also asking, is it in ideas? Is it in traditions of thought? Is it in ideologies? I don't want residuals to become that big of a category. I'm trying to keep it somewhat material in an expansive material sense, but I will think about your question. I guess I would end here. For me, the residuals that we obviously have to take account of are those ecological, political, and economic damages that will not be left behind no matter what political transformations we make. Those are the concrete residuals I have in mind. But you're absolutely right to spy the residuals I'm hanging out with ideationally, and probably psychically. So, but you know, those can probably be resolved generationally. I think another generation could be cut off from them. You don't think so? Okay. So maybe they can't, but I think they're maybe, for me, less of a challenge than nanoplastics. Those residuals are not going away. Climate change is not going away. But that doesn't mean we can't build a world, a future, with it and around it, that's far better than the trajectory that we're on now. I guess we're done.
Wendy, thank you so much.
Thank you.